Hi, everyone. This is Tom Salemi, Device Talks. Welcome back to the Device Talks weekly podcast. We have a jam-packed episode for you today. Sort of batting cleanup at the end of the podcast. We'll have my interview with Fred Khosravi, the CEO of Imperative Care. This was the conversation I had at DeviceTalks West. It ended day one. It was a really great conversation. So much wisdom and experience dropped in 35 minutes or so. So very happy to share that with you on the podcast. Imperative Care was a huge part of DeviceTalks West, and very grateful for their support. Before that, I'll speak with Delphine Zurkiya. She is a senior partner at McKinsey Company, and they've recently released a report on the Medtech industry. We'll review that. But before we get into both of those conversations, I'd like to bring in my colleagues, Kayleen Brown, our managing editor, and Brian Buntz, our pharma editor. Welcome, both of you, to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Tom.
So you have some big news. You delivered an addition to the DeviceTalks podcast family. Could you introduce our listeners to AI Meets Life Sci, the podcast?
Absolutely. We'd be very happy to. So just late last night on Device Talks, we launched AI Meets Life Sci. Just based off of the name alone, this series is meant to really uncover how artificial intelligence and machine learning is being integrated into the life sciences. So it is a little collaboration between us on the Device Talk side, so with a Medtech focus, and then a collaboration with Brian and the pharma side, so drug discovery and development. And then we also are extending the reach to kind of the tech giants, Microsoft's, Amazon, NVIDIA, and more. And the idea behind this series is really to understand how the companies within life sciences are using artificial intelligence to move health forward for better health outcomes.
And have you been happy with the response so far?
The success of our launch has definitely been far beyond my most hopeful optimism. We have had more than 900 plays, and it's not even been 24 hours, which feels just really validating. And I know I'm speaking for Brian here when I say that we had this hunch, Tom, that there would be an appetite in the life sciences for content around artificial intelligence and case studies and real world applications and collaborations, not just talking about the marketing part or the hype of it, but really how it's being used and arguably how it's been used for years. And now maybe just finally getting awareness. And the success of our launch in the last 24 hours has really affirmed that. I think for me and definitely for Brian as well, there's an appetite out there.
And Brian, I know you've been an early evangelist for AI, at least on the Device Talks and WTWH Media Slack channel, but you've really been sort of advancing our understanding of AI and how it can be used for editorial purposes. What are you seeing out there in the life sciences, and what sort of stories have you been uncovering?
I'm seeing some interesting partnerships with big tech companies like Microsoft Azure and like NVIDIA. Interestingly, NVIDIA still is a big GPU company, but now they're also developing tools for drug discovery. So that probably wouldn't have been the case just a handful of years ago. But I think one of the coolest things for this podcast is the caliber of guests that we have. We already have Microsoft Azure. We're working with more big tech companies potentially down the road. We have GE Healthcare, Medtronic lined up, Sanofi, and then other big pharma, big tech, Medtronic, and Medtech companies kind of in the works. So looking forward to covering this kind of nexus between big tech and Medtech and biotech and pharma.
That's great. And Kayleen or Brian, what is the structure of the podcast? What will they be, and how will they be presenting? Because you're doing more than just audio.
Yeah, so we have broken into the world of video. Podcasts have been a wonderful place and home for Device Talks and for Device Talkers, and we're going to continue to stream through all the major podcast channels. So your Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify will still be there. But we wanted to move into video and offer more ways to consume the content, bite-sized pieces, build clips of the video podcast so it can be more shareable on social media, pull out key sort of how-tos or interesting quotes or interesting moments. It was just more of a way of making our content have a further reach, breadth, and depth to it. So that's kind of the visual audio aspect of it. But it's actually interesting. Your question made me think about how the episodes are structured. So to talk about that a little bit, we originally, Bren and I decided that we were going to have one big interview, kind of your typical podcast structure. And in starting to move forward and reaching out to us, Brian mentioned these big companies, these big medtechs, big pharmas, big tech companies. We realized that we weren't getting any no's. It was just, yes, we want to be involved. Can
That's
we do it
great.
this summer? Yes. Yeah, it's been overwhelming, actually, the support we've received with the entire life sciences and tech companies. We did not expect it, Tom. It's been wonderful. But that actually put us in a good problem situation where we realized we needed to have 2 interviews in each episode, that we just couldn't have one episode per episode. There were just too many great conversations to have. So each episode features 2 different conversations, 2 different perspectives, but with the same goal, really talking through how each of these organizations or collaborations are working with artificial intelligence, working with machine learning to apply it to their technologies, the drugs they're discovering, clinical trials, so on and so forth. So you get kind of double the pleasure with each and every one of our episodes.
That's great. And how can folks where can folks find the podcast? Right now it's on the DeviceTalks Podcast Network. It went out, as you mentioned, just a day ago. But going forward, where can folks get future episodes once it's sort of kind of left the nest and gone out on its own?
So season 1 will still live with DeviceTalks. It is part of the DeviceTalks podcast family, so DeviceTalks Podcast Network, and it will always live there. But we have also found a new home for it as well. I mean, as Brian and I were talking about, this conversation transcends all the different silos of life sciences, so medtech and pharma and biotech. So it will have its own home. AI Meets Life Sci on YouTube. So you can find us there. You can also find us on all of the major podcast platforms. So again, Apple, Google, Spotify, AI Meets Life Sci. But I do urge you to go to our website, which is devicetalks.com /AI. Once again, that's devicetalks.com /AI. So you can get all of our episodes and choose how you want to consume it, either podcast or video podcast. It's the easiest way to get there. And you can also explore the other content that we have with DeviceTalks. We have about 8 other podcasts under the DeviceTalks Podcast Network, and you might find something there that you would really enjoy. So I encourage you to go to devicetalks.com /AI.
I think you'll definitely find something there you'll enjoy, because it's just a plethora of great content and conversations.
So you're exactly right, Tom. There's a ton of great content. You're definitely going to find something that you like at devicetalks.com. But I wanted to reiterate that AI Meets Life Sci will have its own podcast home as well from season 2 on. So season 1 is being simulcasted through DeviceTalks and AI Meets Life Sci. But after season 1, you can only find season 2 and beyond if you subscribe to AI Meets Life Sci. So please make sure to do that before the end of season 1.
Great. It's an exciting time. Brian, anything you want to share with the DeviceTalks listeners about this exciting new podcast series?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, Kayleen and I are lining up some really impressive guests at big medtech, cloud, big tech, medtech companies, and was curious if any listeners have any feedback about types of guests and types of programming they would like to see. We can take that into consideration as we plan out kind of like our season 2 and beyond.
Excellent. All right. Well, I hope folks can reach out. They can find, I guess they could reach out to you on LinkedIn, and where would be the best way for folks to get this feedback to you?
LinkedIn or email is bbunts @wtwhmedia.com for email. And then LinkedIn, I'm at Brian K. Buntz.
Excellent. And Kayleen, I'm sure you'll take some feedback as well.
Oh, please. We make the content for our audience and our listeners and our viewers. So please, if you have any suggestions, we would love to hear them. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm on X, Kayleen Brown, Kayleen Brown, just like the color. And my email is kbrown@wtwhmedia.com.
Fantastic. All right. Well, congratulations to you both. It's a great listen, crazy informative, and a great addition to the Device Talks podcast network. So great work.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Now let's get this podcast started. All right. You ready for this?
Ready.
Chris Newmarker isn't here today. He's out sick, but I'm happy to be joined by Delphine Zurkiya. She is a senior partner at McKinsey Company, and she's one of the authors of a report they've released recently called Medtech Pulse, Thriving in the Next Decade, that looks at how medtech leaders can prepare and maneuver for the next phase of medtech. Delphine Zurkiya, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
This is a theme that we're hearing more and more about, just how medtech sort of needs to adapt and needs to deliver devices differently, need to design devices differently, and also need to engage with customers differently. So was happy to latch onto this report, and we can explore some of those points today. And there's several segments to it, and I recommend folks find it at McKinsey.com. Before we even go there, before we delve into the report, would you give me a little bit of introduction to yourself? Normally, I like to understand how folks kind of have found their way into work in the medtech industry. How did you find yourself sort of writing about the medtech industry and covering the medtech industry and leading McKinsey's U.S. medtech practice?
Yeah, happy to. So I'm actually an engineer and a geek by heart. I'm a software engineer by training. So that's I've always been extremely excited at the promise that technology can bring to helping patient lives. And joined McKinsey 17 years ago, and have since then really tried to focus in that intersection of helping technology companies, healthcare technology companies, and medical device companies think about how to continuously innovate and continuously bring those innovations to the bedside of patients.
How did you make that transition from being an engineer? The stereotype is that engineers don't write very much. You're writing these reports. What was that transition like?
So I'm a PhD, so I have to say it was a bit of a wake up call to realize I didn't have to be that precise when I was writing for business. But in the end,
or when you're on podcasts, so you're in good company here. Yeah.
But in the end, I think little story. I left the industry thinking I would come back quickly. I was frustrated that artificial intelligence was not taking off 20 years ago. So I thought, let me take a 2-year stint. When I'll come back, it'll be fully adopted. So here we are. But yeah, no. Ultimately, the reason I'm still in consulting is really, I enjoy looking at the intersection of different concepts, and I think here we're really, at least for the industry, it's quite exciting. We're on a cusp of very different types of innovation, bringing in software and artificial intelligence and many other means, but the basics are still there, and understanding the basics is very important. And ultimately, for technology to get adopted, you have to understand the value chain, the economic flow, the user needs, and that's ultimately why I'm still excited to be helping my clients do that.
That's great. So let's delve into the report. As I said, it's called MedTech Pulse, Thriving in the Next Decade. There's several chapters to it that cover different parts of the medtech industry. So I recommend folks find it and give it a read. But I want to focus on a couple that sort of resonated with me because it's something we've been talking about recently on our podcast and at our conferences. Just sort of how medtech is changing, both from an R&D perspective, but also in a customer engagement perspective. So let's focus first on R&D. What were some of the high-level takeaways that folks might get from the report? You had some interesting information about FDA approvals and the productivity of current R&D practices in medtech.
Yeah, absolutely. And first, we acknowledge in the report how much this industry is really helping save lives and improve lives. One statistic is 5 years have added to life expectancy. If we look at all the devices,
Wow.
10% of the population has an implant. I'm sure at this point, probably 100% of the population has interacted with a device. If you think of Band-Aid as a device, but it is a very important industry, and it's an industry that's showed up extremely well during COVID, as we all know. And so that's something to really acknowledge. It's also an industry that's facing a lot of pressure, like many others, but particularly in medical device. Growth was king up until a few years ago, and I think now we're starting to feel pressure both to grow, but also to be able to grow at a sustainable margins. And so for R&D, to your question, it is starting to put some pressure on the R&D organization to look at what is the productivity of R&D. Mm-hmm. And we've looked at the FDA device trend, and at the heyday in 2011, 196 devices approval per billion of R&D spend. Now in 2022, we're at 74.
Oh wow!
And so there's definitely a slowdown. And again, that's putting now pressure for organizations to say, how can we do most with our spend, or potentially decrease the spend and still be able to innovate at the same rate. And so that's ultimately a lot of what we're discussing in in the boardroom with these R&D leaders.
So what can we connect that to, that decreased I guess my first thought was maybe products are just more expensive, so you are spending more money to get an approval than you might have 10 years ago, or is there more to the story than that?
That's right. There's definitely a very important trend here is the devices are getting smarter. They're getting mm-hmm. smaller, more miniaturized with, minimally invasive surgery. They're also getting much more complex with the advance of robots. It's no longer predominantly hardware. There's a lot of software. And with that comes, a lot more spend. The industry as a whole is spending quite a bit, 8% on average R&D budget versus the automotive industry, which is 4%. So it's already an industry that is spending a lot, and I think mm-hmm. obviously it's becoming the bar to be able to get these devices approved is rising, and so that's driving some of these statistics.
So, what is the challenge then for some of your clients, or are they looking for ways to develop devices for less? Are they looking for ways to get their devices approved more quickly? I'm guessing it's both, but what are some of the things that you're helping with, and some of the information that folks will find in the report?
Yeah, both definitely is the answer, and I think what's interesting is I found really surprising is that we haven't really found a correlation between the amount of spend and the growth of those companies. No meaningfully statistical difference. However, if you look at underneath the spend, the types of practices, there we found some very meaningful differences in what drives higher growth. And there's 5 practices that we outlined in the report. And many of them are not surprising, but I think it reinforces the importance of making sure these practices are being followed. The first one is portfolio management. This is an industry that's been able to grow, as I mentioned, without a lot of pressure. And as a result, there are a lot of devices, devices of multiple versions. And, this is, it's not always easy to do, to end a device, to do life cycle management if we know they're being used and liked by healthcare providers. So really great portfolio management means looking at this on a quarterly basis and saying, how is it that we can migrate our customers to have the best devices and end of life some devices, or maybe even realize that maybe some devices are no longer needed. And ultimately, it translates to reallocating resources where they're needed. And making sure there's the right source of truth. I think often we find it's hard to track exactly who is working on what projects, for example, and therefore, you need that really great discipline. In terms of the practices, we're also finding that we call them power capabilities. Those are new types of talents, such as design thinking is becoming increasingly important. Devices are getting more commoditized, so how can you really truly adapt yourself to the way HCPs want to use those devices? And then from the software industry, we see more and more that a really great product management is important. And this is sort of the mini CEO of a device that really understands the needs, drives the R&D, the lifecycle management, but also how it gets commercialized. And that role becomes very key increasingly. And that's also linked to really great performance.
So what are some of the the qualities of companies that are doing things well? What are 2 or 3 takeaways that folks might get from the report that would help them be more productive and more efficient in their R&D?
Yeah. So I've alluded to 2 of these practices: portfolio management and having the right capabilities. There's a couple more. If you look at the way devices are being developed, I think it's a very stage gate approach, and it has to be for quality assurance and regulatory compliance. But within the stage gates or in between the stage gates, really great companies are finding ways to be much more agile, much more cross-functional, and be able to cut down on time. One anecdote I like is the design history file is often you wait too long to update it, whereas really great companies actually make sure it's getting updated in a digital way on an ongoing basis and significantly cut the amount of time it takes. So little practices like this add up to quite a bit, and we see these being able to be agile means you could cut up to 30% time to market. So to your point, that is very top of mind, but also more productivity. So 20% more productive, meaning you can do the same or more with potentially less less resources.
Did you take a look? I'm curious as to how companies worked effectively with outsourced R&D firms, with smaller product design firms. Were larger companies leaning more heavily upon external R&D firms and product development firms than they might have in the past? Are they bringing more of it in-house? Is there a right way or a wrong way? Is that something you've looked at?
We have historically the industry, unlike the pharmaceutical industry, for example, that's quite externalized. The medical device industry has been much more developing internally and outsourcing pieces of the device development, but really owning the entire process. I think more and more with some of these devices being digital or software, you have to externalize. You're not going to create the entire technology stack. So that means you can see that in 2 ways. One way is to bring in a lot of those components from the outside, from technology companies, for example. Cloud or AI is a perfect example of that. So you don't have to invent it in-house. But another practice is to start externalizing more of the optimally of the resources. Although we are seeing, I think, still leaders for the most part are continuing to own the end-to-end process, but find ways to externalize at the right moment where perhaps there's less IP or more of that talent outside of the company.
Interesting. Well, there's so much to the report we could spend a couple hours talking about it, but let's focus on sort of the later stage area that you talked about, which is how medtech companies have to change how they engage with their customers, with healthcare providers. First, let's sort of set the scene. How do you see the state of hospitals and healthcare workers and the clients and customers of medical devices? What are their lives like right now?
Yeah, and I have to say I'm married to a physician, so
so you can speak to that. You have an N of one in that regard.
That's right, something we speak about a lot. But no, ultimately, it's the same pressure is being felt at the providers, and there's a lot of talk about burnout. There's a lot of staff shortage, and so therefore you also have to do more with less. And we're also seeing HCPs, healthcare providers, be increasingly open to interacting in a digital way. And that can be on the commercial side, but also even using more and more digital devices that can help them become more productive. So that's sort of the stage there where there's also a openness. And to some extent, we also see they do prefer it. So we have a survey that looks at how to interact with HCPs, and we were surprised post-COVID, still now HCPs 2/3 of them would prefer to interact with their sales rep by email over in person. So that's certainly a trend that's here to stay.
Interesting. So we had the news recently, and I don't know if you tracked it or not, but Avail Med Systems had a system that allowed for medical device companies to engage digitally with physicians. Unfortunately, they ran into some the details of which I'm still not sure, but there was a financing challenge. They weren't able to raise money to move forward, and there was a larger question, I think, as to how ready physicians to really have a true kind of digital connection to medical device companies, whether they still want to have the sales rep in the room with them, whether they're ready to sort of use digital tools like they could to make things more efficient for the system as a whole. How do you view where we are in that regard? Are we at a point where hospitals and surgeons are ready for more digital connection, or is that something that you think is going to have to come from the medical device side, and maybe they need to gradually push for that?
So the key word here is omnichannel, which I'm sure you've heard, but that is truly what we see in the data. It is still the case that you do need to interact in person at key moments of the journey. For example, if you try the device, or when you're getting much closer to buying the device, or maybe post sales when you do need often the rep in the room. However, what we're seeing more and more is that these healthcare providers are demanding to interact the way they would interact with their airline company, and be able to actually, whatever was said in person should actually be there when they call their service rep, and should also be there when they log into the website. And so that behavior is the one that we're seeing increasingly change. But it does put more pressure, because that means you have to have multiple channels as opposed to a single channel, and know how to pass information between one channel to the other.
Interesting. So last question. So just looking forward, we talked about sort of how medical device companies can change things in the early part of the process in designing new devices, and how they might want to look at changing how they engage with customers going forward, and include more channels, including digital channels. How do medical devices, do you see medical device companies taking a different form over the next 5 years or so? Do you see some sort of evolutionary change in how they're structured?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think fundamentally, I would say no. The device companies were at its core. If you are selling a device, a hardware, it ultimately the model will continue to be the same. Meaning you are going to be much more in person based. However, the more you introduce software in the device, or the more you have unregulated software around the device, I think the more then you have an opportunity to act like a digital native. And so I actually think there's going to be really two types of companies within a medical device, two-speed perhaps. And the faster speed one will be a software company. And we like to say that the industry should go really from med to tech, and embracing what it means to be a digital native. And if you are selling a piece of software around a device, do you really need to be in person? Can you start borrowing some best practices from the software industry, including how you sell, software as a service? And that requires a lot of different capabilities. So the transition will take some time, because we do need to import that talent in the industry. But we are seeing some companies make that transition faster than others, and their stock price are rewarded to some extent. So there's definitely an incentive for that to happen. But ultimately, the core of it will still remain. We're still a device-driven company, and that will obviously continue to add these years to life expectancy.
Well, lots to think about. Once again, the name of the report is Medtech Pulse: Thriving in the Next Decade. You can find it at McKinsey.com. And thank you, Delphine Zurkiya, for joining us, and for giving us the highlights of the report.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks again to Delphine Zurkiya for joining us on the podcast. Now I'd like to bring in the conversation that I had with Fred Khosravi, the CEO of Imperative Care. Once again, this was one of our keynote conversations at DeviceTalks West. Enjoy.
Are we on, Fred? They don't want to hear me, so I hope that works.
I think it's on.
Okay,
Can you guys hear me?
You're great. All right. Well, welcome to the conference.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. I wanted to. I just mentioned this to Tom before we picked up the mics. Tom's done an amazing job with this meeting. I mean, the work, the lead up to it, all of the energy that you've put into it. It's definitely something to watch. You've been creating this anticipation with us, but I think you've been creating it with the whole device community. So congratulations.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Somewhere along the line, I lost the fear of making a fool of myself, and it's been quite liberating. So
it's good to have some energy to go with it. With that,
yeah. Once you let go of your dignity, the world is filled with opportunities. So But thanks for those comments. So let's focus on you, though. As always with these conversations, we love to hear the origin story. Yours is amazing. I know you were on another podcast where your origin story pretty much took up the whole podcast because you had so many great stories. And while I would love to have you back tomorrow, I'm guessing you're busy. So we'll try to limit the first 5 or 10 minutes to your story as how you entered Medtech, and then we really want to drill down on what you're doing at Imperative Care. So what was it about the Medtech industry that drew you to be part of it?
Yeah, I think one of the probably most pivotal events that happened in my life was when I was working with Silco, an intraocular lens company, in 1986, 1987. Back then, there were 4,000 intraocular lenses being implanted in the world, basically only in the U.S., and a bunch of them were being implanted in Huntington, West Virginia, where I was working for this company that was pioneering intraocular lens development, basically. Today, there's 25 million of them being implanted worldwide. And I was developing the lenses, but I really didn't have any contact with patients. And I eventually ended up getting on a plane out of Huntington, and I sat next to a woman who seemed really old to me at the time. She was probably in her mid-40s. I was in my mid-20s. And she was very chatty, and she literally, even though our seat in between us was empty, she almost put her hand on my knees and said, "Hey, do you know what just happened to me?" And I said, "What?" She goes, 2 weeks ago I was blind, and now I can see. And I said, "Oh, that's interesting." She goes, "They did a surgery on me, they put these lenses, they took my cataract out and put these lenses in, and now I can see." And I realized that she has the technology that I've been working on, and I had never actually had an interaction with a patient. So this is happening by accident on this plane ride. And I never really told her that I'm the guy who's one of the guys who's actually making that lens, because I thought it's going to change the course of the conversations. So she continued and telling me how exciting it is. And then she says, "Do you know what's really exciting about it?" I said, "No, just being blind and now you can see is not enough." She goes, "You know, I could not have taken this flight by myself to Atlanta to see my grandchildren."
Wow.
And the fact that I have these lenses, I can actually do this independently on my own. And at that moment, really, I sat there and I said, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And that's what I've been doing for the rest of my life. Wow. Basically.
That's a good origin story. Yeah. So how did you get from that point to, what was in between that point and your becoming fully involved in the medical device industry? Did you already have a biomedical engineering degree? Did you get one? What was the next step you took? Yeah,
so I went to school in Tennessee, to Tennessee Tech. I'm a refugee from the Iran Revolution. Basically, I came to the U.S. in 1978 and got the best education that I could have ever gotten, basically. For me, I wasn't taking it for granted. And education in a place where there's freedom to learn what you want to learn, as opposed to a central government pushing the education into you, basically, the education that they want to push into you, for me was transformative. Mm-hmm. So I basically got all of the elixir out of the opportunity to have an education. My other option would have been to go back to home and be part of 1 million people who died in a war between Iran and Iraq, basically. And so it was a tremendous opportunity for me to be here. And I actually really understood what freedom is like. Mm-hmm. Freedom to think, freedom to decide to do what you want to do, as opposed to it's being prescribed for you.
Does that appreciation ever diminish?
Has never diminished, no, never.
It's a good thing to remember for sure.
Yeah.
So from that job in West Virginia, Did you pack up your car and I'm heading to Menlo Park and
No.
I'm going to go start me some Medtech company?
No, so the next stop was...
I didn't mean that as a weird West Virginia accent. I was kind of going for a Beverly Hillbillies kind of thing, but anyway.
Yeah, I'm not going to tell you the story of my wife never moved up with me to West Virginia. That's a whole different thing. But I ended up in Seattle. Cooper Vision bought Silco.
Okay.
Silco was a startup company. I went into the headquarters, became the engineering leader for all of the IOL programs that they were developing. And then I got recruited by Advanced Cardiovascular Systems in Santa Clara in 1989. Amr Salihia is here. We worked together 30-some years ago, and we've been working together all along, if you will, from the ACS days. And ended up actually being lucky enough. By the way, my story has a lot of luck built into it. It's never been set up or designed to actually go in the direction that it's gone. So it's never been intentional or volitional, so to speak, the experiences that I've had. I ended up actually getting involved in a program within Advanced Cardiovascular Systems, which was really more of a sideline program. It was an implantable stent technology at a time that only disposable products were available for cardiovascular business, balloons, guide wires, guide catheters. And this side project was actually, had started with through an extraordinary clinician, visionary, Professor Ulrich Sigvart, who actually implanted the first coronary stent in a human in 1986, and declared that within 10 years, most of, or more than 60% of angioplasty is going to be done with stents. And everybody laughed at him and said, there's no way people are going to put implants in people's hearts. Exactly 10 years later, there were more than 75-80% of coronary artery disease being treated with stents. So he was the visionary of all visionaries, and I was lucky enough to work with him and another extraordinary engineer who we're working together right now at Imperative Care, Lilip Lau, who really developed a stent platform. I was the business unit manager at ACS. They brought me from the implantable device industry because of my IOL experience to develop this implantable group basically within a disposable product company. Lilip Lau was the Uber engineer that developed the technology, which really became the platform for all coronary stents that are being used today, to the tune of about 5 million of them, basically. About $25 billion of litigations and settlements that in the stent space based on the Lilip Lau technology, basically. I was a co-inventor with him and a group of people and Ulrich Sigvart to actually develop that technology. So that's what brought me to the Bay Area. And then after that, it was a startup in Boston with Mark Levin, who actually now is the managing partner and founder of Third Rock. Mark was an extraordinary person to look up to.
Was he with Mayfield at the time?
He was with Mayfield,
yeah.
Yes. He was with Mayfield Funds. And they had started a company in Boston and Cambridge, actually. And I walked into the company. There were like 3 people sitting there behind a bunch of computers, basically, and decided to actually join them. I felt like this would be a good journey to go learn from someone like Mark Levin as to what it takes to actually start a company. All the pain and suffering that goes into the excitements, of course, also, but all the pain and suffering, and how does somebody like a Mark Levin handle it? And he was extraordinary. I mean, somebody I still look up to, and made a big impression on me as to what hard work, being resolute in the mission that you're trying to go after, focus on trying to solve a problem as opposed to just developing a technology, looking for a problem, if you will. Those are all the things that I actually learned from Mark Levin.
Can everyone start
that experience?
Can everyone start a company and succeed, or does it take a certain type of person?
Good question. I think everybody can start a company, but I think we all need to surround ourselves with people who are better than us in things that we're not good at, as opposed to trying to both conduct the orchestra and play every instrument, if you will.
So it's not a one person carry the ball over the line kind of thing.
It's not.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah. So you kept starting companies. What was it about the process? And we can highlight one or two of your, but let's choose one of you. I don't want you to pick one of your favorite child, but let's take a particular illustrative example of a successful startup and maybe a lesson learned from it. And then I do want to get into imperative care. And I should have said at the start, when Fred and I talked a couple of weeks ago, I said, do you want to do Q&A? And he said, of course. So we'll have Q&A at the end. So I'll save the last 10 minutes for you folks. I hope you use them. So please come up with some questions and we'll get a mic. Chris, if you could, or someone, if you could make sure you get a handheld. And we are recording this session. I should have said that too. So we'll get the mic so we can hear your question as well. So I gave you enough time to think of a favorite.
Sure.
What was your,
let me actually give you a broader sense.
Sure.
Because if you fast forward from Focal in Cambridge, I came back to the Bay Area and I started a company in 1995 focusing on carotid stenting. It was really novel idea at the time. And I think back then maybe there were 5 or 6 companies in the Bay Area that were venture-backed. There was no there was no ecosystem, Medtech ecosystem of investors. There were, by and large, basically semiconductor and computer folks, so to speak, that were thinking about actually coming into Medtech. And we had gone through the previous 5 years of me coming back to the Bay Area. We had gone through a period where when Medtech was basically at the early stage of burgeoning, companies like ACS and CPI and SciMed and what have you, there were a number of them that were actually developing pioneering technologies. The pharmaceutical companies kind of felt like, oh, these guys are making products for the hospitals, we're selling products to the hospitals, and so we're going to basically take them over. So a number of these the startups of the early 90s in MedTech got acquired by larger companies, by larger pharmaceuticals. When the Bjork-Shiley heart valve debacle happened, there were heart valves that actually had cracks in them that after implantation, you could actually see it on fluoro, that these valves are cracked. And pharmaceutical companies, when they sell a drug, you have to do 1 million patients to understand whether it's actually causing an injury or not. And this is technology that they had acquired where you could actually see the cracks of the valve on fluoro. And so that became a pivotal point that all pharma companies basically divested out of medical devices. They decided this is not for us. This is a whole different ballgame from a regulatory, from a quality, from how you basically work with technology, if you will. And so that basically gave rise to companies like Guidant and Boston Scientific, and there's a number of companies that basically grew out of that evolution. And so that was MedTech, and there was no venture capital, basically. But all of these companies had become actually ACS, Guidant, and a number of other ones. They had become larger companies where, from an innovation standpoint, they needed innovation from the outside. And there was a small group of entrepreneurs who had actually braved the trail, so to speak, to start these companies. And I started one in 1995 also, completely not knowing what the heck I'm getting myself into. But I started one, and maybe it actually, for me, it always underscores if you think something's impossible, you don't end up doing it. And I was kind of lucky enough to not be so smart to understand that it's not impossible, if you will. So started the company. It didn't do so well. It almost fell apart. I learned a lot. That became another pivot in my life. And we were able to kind of put Humpty Dumpty back together again, turn it into a product success, if you will. But that actually gave rise, that experience and the woman on the flight from West Virginia, and the thinking that I want to do this for the rest of my life, we then started looking at planning on how do we create a setup where we can actually contribute to medical device innovation. And through that, we started Incept, my partner, Amar Sahani, and myself. East Coast, West Coast, I'm on the West Coast, he's on the East Coast. And on each of the coasts, we have 4 or 5 companies that we are managing with extraordinary leadership, basically, in each one of those companies. And we each run one of them. So Omar runs one of them, I run one of them here, and the one that I run is Imperative Care. And that's what you were interested in kind of getting to. So
I do want to dig into that. I did want to sort of understand what you learned from that company nearly falling apart and kind of getting stitched back together. In doing so, did you correct something that was going wrong? I
think there was the fundamental thing that was wrong was that I actually thought it was about me.
Okay.
Yeah, and I learned that it can't be about the person who's doing it or running it. It ends up being about the person who's doing it and running it. That I think the probability of failure goes up because you're listening to a lot of people. You're trying to kind of please your investors, please your family, please your employees, please your management, and please the doctors, instead of actually being focused on doing the right thing and having a North Star that you can actually follow. And so it was painful. It was a really painful experience. And we were able to, like I said, put it back together again. I realized that I was the problem. So I literally fired myself from the board with the consent of the investors. And we brought in John Maroney, who ran the company. I learned a ton from John about what leadership is all about. Being an engineer, I always thought leadership is you got to be in everything. You got to be in engineering, in finance, in everything that's going on in the company. And John basically taught me that as a leader, you can't spend all of your time in the business. You got to be spending time on the business, right? That's how you grow a business and move it forward. You got to have people that you trust, right? And let them do what they need to do and make sure there's an accountability process, basically. But the CEO needs to be on the business more than in the business.
That's really good advice.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about Imperative, because that was another part of the prep call that I really enjoyed, where let's get into its origins. It was a technical idea that came to you that you didn't see was right for the time. So go into sort of the very first conversation that ultimately led to the creation of Imperative Care.
So Imperative Care has roots that goes back to probably 20 years ago. Nick Hopkins, who's another one of my mentors and somebody that I seriously look up to in so many different ways, not just clinically, but as I look up to him for life as opposed to just business, which is quite special. Nick has been actually urging me to actually do something in stroke for probably 10 years before Imperative Care started. And in 2015, there was a confluence of a number of things. Technology improved, imaging improved, that you could actually tell whether a kind of ischemic stroke technology actually works or it doesn't work, meaning the non-responders wouldn't be in the denominator of the equation. As long as because when the non-responders are in the denominator of the equation, the rate of success really goes down. And if you have a procedure that succeeds 30-40% of the time, that's really not a procedure. It's got to be 70, 80, 90% of the time. that's when it becomes a procedure. And as long as the non-responders to a therapy end up being in the equation, because you can't tell the responders from the non-responders, then you really don't have a therapy. And I think 2015, it really became the confluence of a point where it seemed like we could actually develop technologies where we can bring the product response to patients, basically, to about 80, 90%. And so that really became the right time to actually do this. Nick was the real visionary behind the vision of imperative care. Mm-hmm. I've always followed I'm not one of those smart engineers who can actually think up great technologies. I'm always following clinical lead and clinical direction. Always really interested in solving a problem and working backwards and developing a technology portfolio that solves a clinical problem, basically. And so tapping into clinical focus has always been really important to me. So the vision of imperative care was set by Nick Hopkins, where his belief was that we need to elevate stroke care, and we elevate it first by making the procedure simpler and faster, because for an ischemic stroke procedure, if it takes about an hour and a half, the patients actually end up suffering from that length of ischemia. Basically, the number of neurons are ending up in billions that are lost over that period of time, if you will, and infarct in the brain, and outcomes basically diminish if the procedure is too long. So his belief was that this procedure really, with the right technologies, need to be able to be done in about 10 minutes, from stick to revascularization in 10 minutes. And the way he believed that we need to do this is actually elevate access. So when we were coming into this space, basically, the standard procedure is that you park an access device in the carotid artery, which is a large, more stiffer device, so to speak, because it's access from the groin to the carotid artery. And then through that, you have a more trackable, smaller, flexible device that goes all the way into the brain, basically going through 360 loops and what have you. But if you have to then do one pass of getting the clot out, but you haven't gotten all of it out, and you have to go back, every one of those exchanges through that access end up taking about 15 to 20 minutes. So procedure, if it's 3 passes to completely clear the brain, you're essentially taking about an hour with 3 exchanges. But Nick's vision was that if you actually take the access and take it all the way to the clot, then taking care of that clot is a layup. Then going back and forth is not going to take that long. And in fact, by having the largest device, the largest lumen, all the way close to the clot, you can actually aspirate from that large lumen and do it in one pass. And so today, with the Zoom stroke solution, I think you had a panel this morning of our leadership, which is an extraordinary group of people to be with. Every one of them in their own rights have been success stories in the Medtech space. And they've chosen to actually come do this. Amr Salehi and I worked with an extraordinary cardiologist by the name of Don Baim, who is fundamental in the way the cardiovascular business has evolved. He's passed now. But Don, when he actually went to Boston Scientific and became the chief medical officer there, and I asked him, I said, Don, how are things going? He was basically the chief of cardiology at Harvard, if you will. And when I asked him how that's going, Don basically said something that I feel today at Imperative Care, is that he said, Fred, I feel like I've actually worked my entire career to one day be able to come do something like this.
Wow.
And I think our leadership, if you look at the success that they've had, and they're here, building this very intentional. So while my life has been accidental, basically, the work that we're doing at Imperative Care is very much built for purpose. It's very much intentional. And all of these leaders have actually come done everything in their lives to be able to do something like this one day.
I mean, what's impressed me with learning about imperative care is just the conversation doesn't end with the discussion of the device, that there's your mission is broader, and you alluded to aiding stroke patients. Was that the mission from the very start, or did imperative care start off as a device company and then you saw a need for some of the other things we'll talk about and it's grown into that, or was that fuller mission baked in from the start?
Yeah, I'll tell you a little bit of a story.
Sure.
I think it ties back to Nick Hopkins. So when I was talking to Nick Hopkins about starting imperative care, he was getting treated for cancer at the Mayo Clinic. I'm a cancer survivor. He's a great friend. And so I went to visit him, not to start a company, by the way. I went to visit him to commiserate with a friend, with a fellow cancer survivor, hopefully. At that meeting, I stayed there for about a day and a half. He gave me like 15 minutes rundown of all of his kind of stroke, of his cancer treatment. Boom, 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 as if he was giving grand rounds. And then he wanted to talk about stroke. That's all he wanted to talk about. And I was completely baffled by that because I really, as a cancer survivor, I had gone to commiserate with a friend. And he didn't want to have any of it. He just wanted to talk about cancer. We started at 10 o'clock in the morning at a breakfast table, and I think we got up at like about 6 o'clock in the afternoon from that table. And we talked about stroke that entire day. Mm-hmm. And the next day that I left Rochester to head back to Minneapolis, I told Nick, I said, my answer is still no, but I'm going to go think about it, and maybe it turns into a maybe. Mm-hmm. Right? And I thought about it quite a bit on the ride back to Minneapolis. And then 3 months later, we actually ended up having a full day conference with Nick and 3 of his proteges, Dr. Jay Mako, Dr. Adnan Siddiqui, and Dr. Cole Turk, who we brought to the table. I had a team with me of Yi Yang, who's our Chief Technology Officer, and Gerard Van Hoffman, who's now with us as our Chief Patent Counsel at Imperative Care. Mm-hmm. We went to that meeting at the Yale Club, and the vision that was actually outlined for Imperative Care was actually outlined at that meeting. Okay. David Holmes, by the way, from Mayo Clinic joined us as well for that conversation. And the one thing that I actually let this team know, because these guys were the best of the best in ischemic stroke, in hemorrhagic stroke, and everybody was at the top of their game. I had actually thought about it for a while, basically. I'd been looking at it from pattern recognition for about 20 years, and from meeting Nick in Rochester, and then those 2-3 months before we had that meeting at the Yale Club, I thought quite a bit about what I want to do, mm-hmm. right? And I realized that I'm probably not going to get excited to jump out of bed every morning going and making a device. And so I felt like the only way that I can actually do this, that I could be excited about this, is really changing and making a bigger impact on the space and on the technology. Almost like recreate ACS. ACS was a very special place that we grew up in. And the question for me was, can that be recreated? A company that is ignited by clinical view, developed and growing with good people doing great things, basically. And I can be every day surrounded by the people that I'm surrounded with to feel insecure about myself and what I do. Is that recreatable? And my perspective was that with Nick, and we talked about this at this meeting, which really became the cornerstone of what the vision, the purposeful vision about imperative care was that I realized that the first technology for pulling clot out of someone's brain was developed in 2003, a technology called Mercy. when we were entering this space, it was 2016. Today, 2023, 20 years later, after the Mercy device, there's 1 out of 5 patients in the United States that gets this most powerful treatment in medicine ever. Acute life and death. 1 out of 5 patients get it, 20% of the US population. So I sat down and I started thinking about it. I said, if it's taken 20 years to get to 20%, if we want to get to 80%, if you kind of extrapolate that, and the rate of innovation, by the way, has been really high. At that rate, it's going to be 2080 before 80% of the US population gets this technology. And so making the catheters, keep making the catheters better, eventually comes to an asymptotic place where the catheter works. We developed it. We have the Zoom system. But today, more than 60% of the procedures are done basically TICI 3, meaning full revascularization, at under 10 minutes. We can make it better. We are going to make it better. We're going to continue making the technology better. But making the catheters better is not going to make it available to more patients. So the way to make it available to more patients is to bring digital health and automation and robotics to it. If patients who don't get to the treatment, you can create detection devices, basically. As you know, angina is a detection system for heart attacks, but there is no detection system for stroke. So developing wearable detection technologies that gets patients to the right treatment, basically, not end up in the wrong hospitals. There are 900 cath labs in the United States that actually perform these procedures. There are 6,000 cath labs in the United States. And so you got to end up in the right hospital. If you end up in the wrong hospital, you're screwed, right? And if you're in a rural hospital, you're also relatively screwed, right? Because it's like you got to get put on a helicopter and taken to the hospital, or the physician has to basically drive to you to actually do the procedure. So digital health for us was getting the patients to the right treatment, and robotics, which is the technology we're working on at Telos, which is remote intervention. We feel that it's the best use case for medical robotics, basically. Remote intervention for stroke treatment. And that technology is supposed to take wherever a stroke specialist, neurologist is not available, you could put a robot in those cath labs, right? The cath lab is there, the capital equipment is there. There's a cardiologist that is actually on call to do STEMI. They don't have to do the procedure. The robot does the procedure, and the physician at a remote facility, at a stroke center, basically drives the robot.
Isn't that, I mean, that's a complex technology to be able to perform those remotely. Why not leave that to a company that's focused exclusively on surgical robotics, and you focus exclusively on your devices and kind of go the way that the industry has gone?
Very good question. Fundamentally, because interventional robotics is not surgical robotics. It's not just cutting things and sewing things and what have you. It's about basically linear coaxial motion. It's about fluidics. It's about catheters of the future. You can't really use catheters of today for a technology that's going to be in the marketplace in 2028. You have to really bring all of those 3 pillars to the table. And I think we are the only company, I feel like, in the world that can actually do that. So
does this go, or this is sort of summing up a few of the conversations we've had today where Medtech, you know, we companies say that they're patient-centric because they're developing devices for patients, to help patients, but there seems to be a different energy spirit where companies are trying to take a look at the entire spectrum of the patient experience. Is this the direction that Medtech is going to go more broadly? Do we see Medtech companies of the future 5 years from now sort of, again, those that can, taking that broader, more holistic look at things, or is imperative care an outlier?
I don't think imperative care is an outlier, but it shouldn't be an outlier, is my sense. And I don't want to give I have a dream speech, but I do have a dream that we go to a place where Medtech, medicine in general, is going to become something that focuses more on the patient as opposed to their disease. I think there's too much disease focus. There's too much hammer and nail is going on. Stroke is one of those diseases that really requires that continuum of care type of energy and connected care innovations, basically. Otherwise, the patients are going from silo to silo, and they're confused at every silo. Like from home to ambulance to getting treated and then going to a rehab center. This is why there's so many readmissions of stroke patients. Most of the readmissions, by the way, for stroke survivors is about hip fractures and urinary tract infection, because they're not following the right approach. I mean, these are low-hanging fruits to try to present them. And a patient who actually has a stroke patient who gets readmitted to the hospital has a 60% higher chance of actually getting another stroke and dying from it. Low-hanging fruit. UTI and hip fractures, if you prevent those, you're going to save a lot of lives. And this is why we have Can Do Health. This is why we have actually created a platform that actually stays with the patients and follows the patients and makes them feel like they're not alone, because you do. It's being a stroke survivor is a very isolating business. You become very isolated. I've learned that along the way, and it's my throat gets full as I think about it. The number of stroke survivors that I've seen. One of the things that they basically told myself and Kirsten Carroll in this process is nothing about us without us, because nobody understands what we go through. They get isolated. Mm-hmm. They're no longer, and we don't hear about them anymore, because who wants to deal with a stroke survivor at a party?
And it happens in a day, in a moment. It goes from one moment to the...
And I think to realize that they're not alone, to realize that there's a community that's reeling with this, to realize that there's basic things that you could do for these guys to not get UTIs and hip fractures and not get readmitted to the hospital, literally increases, and we're demonstrating that it can do. It basically improves modified Rankin scores from 2 to 3 to 0 to 1. I think I may be misquoting this, but maybe in 80% of the cases that go through this program.
I'm going to ask one more question, then if anyone has a question from the audience, Sean has the microphone. You referenced in the 90s, I'm sorry, I forget the name, but the physician who predicted
Ulrich Sigvard.
The use of coronary stents and people laughing at him. Do you feel people are laughing at you or imperative care? How are you getting received by the industry? Because it's a Hail Mary pass that you're throwing, or do people say, good for you, like, way to lead?
Yeah. I think if people are not laughing at you a little bit, you're probably not trying hard enough, right? I mean, it's just...
Amen, yes.
Yeah, naturally. Because it is, what we're doing is different. I mean, instead of taking, I was just talking to Daniel Hawkins, who's in the audience. If you're taking 5 boulders up the hill, the probability of failure goes up by quite a bit. Right? If you're taking 1 boulder up the hill, focus really makes you achieve what you're doing with a higher probability. And we're taking 5 boulders up the hill. I would say in conventional thinking about medtech, it doesn't make sense. And that's why I'm calling it Medtech 3.0, where we're essentially creating a hyper-growth revenue company in stroke and vascular, but we're also making significant investments into the back half of the decade and the next decade so that there is durability and continuity of that growth.
I wish I had talked to you before I came up with the title for the talk, because Medtech 3.0 is much better than that. Any questions from folks in the audience? We'll get a few minutes, and then we'll have some time together outside. Okay. Good. More for me. Are you? Do you feel as if this is? I mean, if the people are laughing at you silently, I opened this up, and we opened up the day. Kind of again, there seems to be a different element of this conversation in medtech where people are. I think we've always again said we're patient centric, but I don't know. Maybe I'm taking our conversation and projecting it onto others. But do you feel like there's some kind of change happening in how medtech companies will be formed in the future, with more patient engagement? Certainly we're talking more about health equity. We're talking about getting devices to the people who need it the most. I think that's all fantastic that we're having those conversations. But are we going to see talk turn into action and evolution of this industry?
I'm going to say something. I don't mean to be kind of sexist or raise the ire of half of the population here. But I really do think that for medicine to shift into treating the patient as opposed to treating the disease, we need more women in medicine. We need more women in leadership in companies that are treating technologies for medicine. I'm not saying 100%, no. But I think we're woefully behind. And I believe that women in medicine and women in leadership in these companies will shift medicine to focusing on the patient as opposed to the disease. We're all kind of hammer and nail people.
Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah. I think, how can I ask another question? I'm dropping the mic, and we'll go have some time outside. So thank you, Fred Khosravi, for sharing your story today.
Thank you, guys.
Well, that is a wrap. Thanks so much for joining us on this episode of the DeviceTalks Weekly Podcast. Once again, please like, follow, and or subscribe to the DeviceTalks Podcast Network. You'll receive future episodes of the DeviceTalks Weekly Podcast, of our corporate podcasts, including Stryker Talks, Intuitive Talks, Abbott Talks, Boston Scientific Talks. And we have more and more coming, including, just released this week, AI Meets Life Sci. So you can catch season 1 of AI Meets Life Sci on the DeviceTalks Podcast Network, but make sure you look for the AI Meets Life Sci podcast channel so you can subscribe directly to that. Please make sure you connect with all of us on LinkedIn. I'm Tom Salemi at DeviceTalks. You can catch me there. You can catch Chris Newmarker as in a Newmarker there. And of course, Kayleen Brown, our managing editor of DeviceTalks, and Brian Buntz, Buntz, on LinkedIn. Connect with us all. Please enjoy the AI Meets Life Sci podcast and share it on social media. Share this episode of the DeviceTalks Weekly Podcast as well. And when you do, make sure you tag all of us so we can be part of that conversation. A little bit of a programming note. We will not have a DeviceTalks Weekly Podcast next week for Thanksgiving week. We're going to take the week off, but we'll be back not the week after, but the week after that. But we'll have 2 podcasts coming out your way the week after Thanksgiving, including another new podcast led by our managing editor, Kayleen Brown. So lots going on here at DeviceTalks Podcast Land. Great to have you as part of it. And I hope you all have a wonderful Thanksgiving. If you're in the U.S. and you celebrate, hope you enjoy some warm time with family and friends. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks on the DeviceTalks Weekly Podcast.